The radio clicked, spitting a burst of dead air static before the general's voice broke through. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound commanding. He sounded hollow. "We're doomed." He dropped the handset. 7 seconds later, the sky ripped open with a sound like tearing canvas. The Warthog had arrived. General David Harris bled from a ragged gash above his left eyebrow. The blood mixed with the chalky white dust of the valley floor, running into his eye and stinging like battery acid. He didn't bother wiping it away. There was no point in keeping a clear view of a slaughter. He pressed his back against the crumbling remains of a mud brick retaining wall. Every time a heavy caliber round slammed into the other side of the barrier, the wall shuddered, dusting his shoulders with centuries-old dirt. To his left, Specialist Miller lay on his back, staring blankly at the bruised purple sky of the encroaching dusk. Miller wasn't dead, but the tourniquet pulled high and tight around his missing right leg told Harris the kid was running out of time. They all were. The ambush had been textbook, flawless. Harris had to respect it, even as it dismantled his command. They had been funneled into the dry riverbed, a classic kill box, by a series of small, nagging skirmishes that disguised the enemy's true numbers. Now, 300 hardened fighters held the high ground on 3 sides. Harris had 42 men left. Half of them were combat ineffective. "Ammo count," Harris rasped. His throat felt lined with sandpaper. Sergeant First Class Reynolds didn't look up from his rifle sights. He fired a 3-round burst at a muzzle flash on the ridgeline, then ducked as a hail of return fire chipped away the rock inches from his helmet. "Green Squad is down to secondary mags, sir. Blue is completely black. We're throwing rocks in about 4 minutes." Harris nodded slowly. He looked down at the heavy military radio resting between his boots. The handset was cracked, the casing scuffed. For the past 40 minutes, it had been his only lifeline to the outside world, a lifeline that had offered nothing but apologies. The weather system rolling over the mountains was a solid block of angry cumulonimbus clouds. Fast movers, F-16S and F-35S, couldn't risk the deck without flying straight into the granite peaks. Apaches were grounded 50 miles away. They were utterly alone. Another mortar shell shrieked through the air, detonating 20 yards away. The concussive wave punched the breath out of Harris's lungs. Shrapnel whined overhead like angry hornets. Someone screamed, a high, thin sound that broke off abruptly. Harris was a career infantryman. He had spent 30 years internalizing the brutal arithmetic of war. He knew how to calculate distance, velocity, troop movement, and acceptable losses. He ran the numbers now, sitting in the dirt with the smell of copper blood and sulfur thick in his nose. 42 men, 300 enemies. No air support, no artillery range. 4 minutes of ammunition. The math was definitive. It was terminal. He reached down and picked up the radio handset. He depressed the push-to-talk button. He didn't call for artillery. He didn't ask for an ETA on the medevac that wasn't coming. He simply spoke to the command center sitting safe in a climate-controlled tent 100 miles away. "This is outstation actual," Harris said. The command edge was completely gone from his voice. It was just the voice of an old man sitting in the dirt. "We are out of time. We are out of rounds. We're doomed." He let the handset slip from his fingers. It bounced in the dust. He drew his sidearm, checked the chamber, and waited for the ridgeline to swarm. 70 miles away, At an altitude of 15,000 feet, Captain Sarah Mitchell tasted copper. It wasn't blood. It was the stale metallic tang of instant coffee and adrenaline that coated the back of her throat. She sat strapped into the cramped utilitarian cockpit of an A-10C Thunderbolt II. The heating system in the jet was notoriously temperamental. Right now, it was blowing tepid air that smelled faintly of burning rubber and hydraulic fluid. Her call sign was Grudge. She had earned it during her first tour for carrying a relentless, quiet intensity into every debriefing, but today she just felt tired. She was flying a holding pattern over a sprawling expanse of jagged, unnamed peaks, staring at a radar screen painting a massive, impenetrable storm front. The A-10 wasn't a sleek, supersonic fighter jet. It wasn't designed to dogfight or outrun missiles. It was a flying tank, an ugly, twin-engine beast built entirely around a 30mm, 7-barrel Gatling gun. It shook. It rattled. It handled with the grace of a flying dump truck. Sarah loved every rivet of it. She was listening to the command net on her secondary headset, half tuning out the bureaucratic chatter of air traffic controllers and distant AWACS planes. But then a voice cut through the static. "We are out of time. We are out of rounds. We're doomed." Sarah blinked. The voice was bone dry, defeated. She recognized the call sign. It was the ground element pinned down in the Ashkar Valley, the ones the fast movers couldn't reach because of the cloud cover. She looked out her canopy. Below her, the cloud deck was a churning sea of dark gray and bruised purple. It was thick, turbulent, and rested heavily on the jagged mountain peaks. Dropping through that without visibility was suicidal. You wouldn't know you were hitting a mountain until the granite tore the wings off. "Command, this is Bore 1. Sarah thumbed her mic, her voice flat, betraying none of the sudden spike in her heart rate. "Confirm the status of outstation actual. Bore 1. Command. Ground element is black on ammo. Enemy forces are advancing. You are to remain in your holding pattern. Weather is a no-go for close air support. Acknowledge." Sarah stared at the altimeter. She looked at the fuel gauge. She felt the heavy, comforting vibration of the control stick in her right hand. She thought about the voice on the radio. "We're doomed." A cynical smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. The Air Force loved its rules. It loved its weather minimums and its acceptable risk matrices. But Sarah didn't fly a spreadsheet. She flew a warthog. "Command, Bore 1 is experiencing a navigational malfunction," Sarah lied smoothly. "I am deviating from holding pattern, dropping altitude to troubleshoot." "Bore 1, negative. Do not drop altitude. That airspace is completely obscured. You will—" Sarah reached over and clicked the primary radio off. The cockpit went suddenly, blessedly quiet, save for the deep, resonant hum of the twin TF-34 turbofans. "All right, ugly," Sarah muttered, patting the console. "Let's go to work." She slammed the stick forward. The plunge into the clouds was instantaneous. The world outside the canopy vanished, replaced by a swirling, violent gray fog. Instantly, the A-10 began to buck. Violent updrafts and downdrafts slammed into the aircraft. Sarah's harness locked out, pinning her shoulders against the seat as negative G's tried to pull her through the roof. She kept her eyes glued to her instruments. In zero visibility, spatial disorientation could kill a pilot in seconds. Your inner ear tells you you're flying straight, but the artificial horizon says you're inverted. Sarah ignored her stomach. She trusted the glowing green dials. Altitude dropping. 12,000 feet. 10,000. Rain lashed the canopy like handfuls of gravel. Lightning flashed, momentarily blinding her, illuminating the cockpit in stark, skeletal white. The turbulence grew worse, rattling her teeth. The A-10 groaned, the airframe protesting the immense stress. But the plane had been built in the Cold War to take Soviet anti-aircraft fire and keep flying. It was wrapped in a titanium tub. It could take a little bad weather. 8,000 feet. The digital map showed the valley walls closing in. She was dropping into a canyon, blind. If she drifted a few hundred yards to the left or right, she would vaporize against the rock wall. Sweat stung her eyes. She didn't blink. Her hands gripped the throttle and stick with white-knuckled intensity, making microscopic adjustments to keep the massive plane centered in the invisible corridor. 6,000 feet. The radar altimeter began to scream, a high-pitched warning that the ground was coming up fast. "Come on," she whispered, her voice tight. "Brake." At 4,000 feet, she punched through the bottom of the cloud deck. The gray instantly gave way to the bruised twilight of the valley, and the valley was on fire. From her vantage point, diving at 300 knots, the dry riverbed looked like a glowing ant farm. Brilliant green and red tracers crisscrossed the dark expanse, converging on a single, battered structure at the center. It was a torrential downpour of ordnance. The enemy had them completely encircled. Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't have time to run a neat, textbook targeting pass. She had to act purely on instinct and geometry. She banked hard left, pulling 4 Gs, the G-suit clamping down on her legs to keep the blood in her head. She aligned the nose of the A-10 with the northern ridgeline, where the heaviest concentration of muzzle flashes was erupting. "Master arm on," she muttered, flipping the switch. On the ground, General Harris had closed his eyes. The roar of the encroaching enemy was deafening. They were close enough now that he could hear them shouting, calling to each other over the gunfire. He heard the metallic clatter of bayonets being fixed. Then he felt it. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a vibration, a low rhythmic thrumming in the dirt beneath him. It felt like an earthquake waking up. He opened his eyes. The men around him had stopped firing. They were looking up. Dropping out of the boiling black clouds above them was a shadow. It was moving too slow to be an F-16, too low to be a bomber. It was a massive, blunt-nosed silhouette with straight wings and 2 oversized engines mounted on its back. It looked archaic. It looked brutal. As it dived, the enemy forces on the ridgeline realized what it was. The barrage of fire directed at Harris's men abruptly ceased. Every weapon on the mountain pivoted upward. A torrent of heavy machine gun fire lashed out at the sky. Tracing rounds bounced off the A-10's nose. Harris watched in stunned disbelief. He knew what a warthog was, but seeing it shrug off anti-aircraft fire like rain off a windshield was something else entirely. The aircraft didn't flinch. It just kept diving, a heavy, unstoppable spear aimed directly at the high ground. In the cockpit, Sarah ignored the sparks showering off her canopy as small arms fire pinged against the bulletproof glass. She was entirely focused on the green reticle projected onto her heads-up display, the Pipper. She walked the rudder pedals, shifting the plane's nose a fraction of an inch to the right. The Pipper settled over the largest cluster of enemy combatants on the ridge. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon did not sound like a gun. A gun goes bang. The Avenger fires 30mm depleted uranium armor-piercing shells at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. When Sarah pulled the trigger, the entire aircraft decelerated. The recoil of the weapon was so massive it physically slowed the jet down in mid-air. The cockpit filled with the sharp, acidic smell of cordite. The floorboard shook so violently her teeth rattled in her skull. From the aircraft's nose, a beam of solid, blinding light erupted. It was a continuous stream of fire, a fire hose of pure destruction arcing down toward the earth. Harris watched the ridgeline disappear. The impact of the shells was apocalyptic. The mountain itself seemed to explode. Boulders the size of cars were shattered into dust. The enemy trench line was simply erased, turned into a churning blender of fire, pulverized rock, and red mist. The sheer kinetic energy of the depleted uranium rounds hitting the earth created a wall of flying debris 50 feet high. It took a full 2 seconds for the sound to reach the valley floor. It wasn't an explosion. It was a sound that tore at the eardrums and vibrated in the chest cavity. Brrrr. It sounded like the sky was being ripped in half by a chainsaw. It was a mechanical, guttural roar that drowned out the thunder, drowned out the rain, and drowned out the war. Sarah pulled back on the stick, snapping the A-10 out of its dive just a few hundred feet above the valley floor. She banked violently, her wingtip nearly scraping the opposite canyon wall, and threw the plane back up into the gloom to circle for another pass. Down in the mud, Harris slowly lowered his sidearm. He stared at the smoking, cratered ruin of the northern ridge. Nothing moved up there. Nothing could have survived. He looked over at Sergeant Reynolds. The seasoned, battle-hardened NCO was kneeling in the dirt, his mouth hanging open, staring at the sky where the ugly jet had vanished. Harris reached down into the dirt and picked up the cracked radio handset. He pressed the button. "Command," Harris said, his voice no longer hollow. The adrenaline was back, sharp and electric. "Cancel that last transmission. We're not dead yet." Sarah hauled the A-10 into a punishing vertical climb. G-forces crushed her into the ejection seat, a physical weight sitting directly on her chest. The blood pooled in her legs, fighting the compression of her G-suit. Her vision tunneled, the edges of her peripheral sight bleeding out into static gray. She gritted her teeth, forcing shallow, rapid bursts of oxygen into her lungs. She leveled out at 3,000 feet, hiding briefly in the churning underbelly of the storm clouds. Her breathing was loud over the intercom. The fuel gauge was dipping below optimal, and the master caution light blinked a steady, annoying yellow sequence on the dash. Small arms fire had shredded a few non-essential sensors on her right wing. She ignored the yellow light. "Command bore 1, first pass complete, re-engaging." There was no immediate response. They were probably still scrambling to figure out how a pilot had deliberately severed communications and dive-bombed a blind canyon in zero visibility weather. Let them figure it out. Down in the mud, men were bleeding. She banked the heavy jet, checking her remaining ordnance. 2 AGM-65 Maverick air-to-surface missiles, 2 pods of unguided Hydra rockets, and about 800 rounds left in the drum for the Avenger. It was enough to cause serious problems, provided she didn't get blown out of the sky first. The enemy had recovered from the shock. As Sarah pushed the nose down for her second run, the eastern ridgeline lit up. It wasn't just small arms fire this time. Heavy, rhythmic flashes pulsed from the rock formations. "Dushka!" the 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns. They could chew through a fuselage if they scored a concentrated hit. Worse, her radar warning receiver suddenly squealed, a high-pitched, frantic tone that spiked the hair on the back of her neck. Missile launch. Someone down there had a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile. An Igla, probably. Cheap, heat-seeking, and deadly. "Chaff! Flares!" Sarah yelled into the empty cockpit, hammering the dispense button. A rapid-fire series of thumps echoed behind her as magnesium flares blasted from the countermeasure pods on her tail, blooming into intensely hot, white fireballs. She wrenched the stick to the left, standing the Warthog on its wing, and chopped the throttle to reduce her engine heat. The missile streaked past her canopy, a blur of white smoke and orange exhaust. It missed the right engine nacelle by less than 50 feet, lured away by the descending cluster of flares. It detonated against the canyon wall, showering the gorge in a brief rain of pulverized granite. "Not today," Sarah muttered, shoving the throttle back to max. Down below, General Harris watched the deadly geometry unfold in the sky. He could see the Warthog twisting and jinking, trailing white smoke and bright defensive flares. The A-10 was a lumbering beast, but in the hands of a pilot who knew how to ride the edge of a stall, it was dangerously agile. "Reynolds!" Harris shouted over the deafening crack of enemy rifles. "Status on the East Ridge. They're setting up a mortar tube, sir," Reynolds yelled back, his face streaked with cordite and dirt. He fired 2 single shots from his M4, saving his dwindling ammunition. "They get that dialed in. They'll drop shells right on top of Miller and the wounded." Harris grabbed the radio. "Bore 1, outstation actual. We have a heavy mortar team setting up on the eastern slope, elevation roughly 200 feet above our position. They are prioritizing the wounded." "Copy that, actual." Sarah's voice crackled back instantly. It was tight, straining against G-forces, but calm. "Keep your heads down. I'm bringing the thunder." Sarah didn't have time to visually acquire the mortar tube. She relied on the coordinates in her head, overlaying the terrain map onto the dark, chaotic reality rushing up to meet her windshield. She armed the Maverick missiles. The lock-on tone chirped. A solid square boxed a cluster of thermal signatures on her screen. "Rifle," she announced calmly. The A-10 shuddered as the massive missile ripped free from the underwing pylon. A thick trail of gray exhaust smoke painted a direct line from the aircraft to the eastern ridgeline. The explosion was blinding. A massive fireball of orange and black rolled up the side of the mountain. The concussive wave hit the valley floor a second later, knocking dust loose from the ruined walls around Harris. The mortar team, the heavy machine guns, and a 50-yard stretch of rock simply ceased to exist. But the enemy wasn't completely broken. As Sarah pulled out of the dive, the western ridgeline opened up. A sustained burst of heavy 14.5 millimeter anti-aircraft fire stitched a line across the sky. Sarah threw the plane into a hard barrel roll, but the A-10 wasn't fast enough to completely clear the kill zone. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was sickening. It was the sound of heavy metal slamming into heavier metal. The A-10 violently shuddered. The master warning panel illuminated entirely, a Christmas tree of catastrophic failure. The right engine temperature gauge spiked instantly. The RPMs plummeted. A loud, terrifying grinding noise vibrated through the airframe, followed by a sudden, jarring loss of thrust. The plane immediately began to yaw hard to the right, dragging its wounded wing. Sarah looked over her shoulder. The right TF-34 engine was trailing thick, oily black smoke. A lick of orange flame curled around the nacelle housing. "Engine fire, right engine," she said aloud, her training taking over the sudden spike of pure terror. She slammed the right throttle to the idle stop. She reached up and pulled the T-handle, cutting off fuel, hydraulic fluid, and electrical power to the burning engine. Finally, she hit the extinguisher discharge switch. The fire suffocated, leaving only the black smoke pouring from the dead turbine. But the damage was deeper than the engine. The controls in her hands were suddenly heavy. The hydraulic pressure gauges for the primary flight control systems were dropping to 0. The anti-aircraft rounds had severed the redundant hydraulic lines. The nose of the Warthog began to dip uncontrollably toward the jagged mountain peaks. The ground was rushing up. Down in the mud, Harris watched the A-10 falter. He saw the black smoke. He saw the ugly, beautiful plane begin its fatal descent. "No," Reynolds whispered, lowering his rifle. The radio crackled. It was Sarah. "Outstation actual bore 1. I have lost right engine. Primary hydraulics are gone. I am entering manual reversion." Flying an A-10 in manual reversion was not flying. It was a wrestling match with 30,000 pounds of dead metal. Without hydraulics, the pilot had to physically move the control surfaces using sheer muscle and a complex system of cables and pulleys. It was exhausting, imprecise, and incredibly dangerous. Sarah grabbed the stick with both hands, planting her boots firmly on the rudder pedals. Her muscles strained instantly. The stick felt like it was encased in wet concrete. "Come on, you ugly bastard," she grunted, pulling back with everything she had. Her shoulders screamed. Her biceps burned. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose of the plane began to lift. She fought the asymmetrical thrust of the single working engine, stomping on the left rudder to keep the plane flying somewhat straight. She was flying a broken, crippled brick. She was losing altitude. She had one engine, no hydraulics, and she was sweating through her flight suit. Standard operating procedure dictated that she gain altitude, point the aircraft toward friendly territory, and pull the ejection handles. The plane was done. She looked down at the tactical display. The western ridgeline was still swarming. The enemy realized the air support was crippled. They were rushing down the slopes, abandoning their cover to close the final distance to the pinned-down Americans. Harris had maybe 50 yards of breathing room left. Sarah looked at the ejection handle between her knees, yellow and black stripes. One pull, and she would be rocketing up into the cold, safe air. She would survive. She looked back up at the valley. She didn't pull the handle. "Bore 1, command." A panicked voice finally broke through the static. It was a colonel. "We track a catastrophic hydraulic failure. Climb to safe altitude and eject. I repeat, eject." Sarah clicked the mic. "Negative, command. I still have rounds in the drum." She wrenched the heavy stick to the left, fighting the plane's desire to roll over and die. She used the rudder to swing the nose around, lining up for one final, desperate pass. Without hydraulics, she couldn't make fine adjustments. She had to aim the entire aircraft with brute force. "Actual, bore 1, Sarah gasped, her arms trembling from the exertion. "I am on final approach. I cannot pull up hard. Keep your heads in the dirt." Harris heard the transmission. He looked at the waves of fighters pouring down the western slope. They were close enough now that he could see the expressions on their faces. "Everyone down!" Harris roared. "Get in the dirt! Now!" He threw himself over Miller, pressing the wounded specialist flat against the hard earth. The sound returned, that low, vibrating thrum. But this time, it was ragged. It sounded wounded. The A-10 crested the southern ridge, flying barely 100 feet off the ground. It was crabbing sideways, trailing a thick plume of black smoke from its dead engine. It looked like a dying animal, making one last spiteful lunge. Sarah had the stick pulled back to her stomach with her left hand. Her right hand hovered over the weapon's release. She didn't bother with the targeting computer. She just looked through the glass and waited for the enemy to fill the windshield. "Have some of this," she whispered. She pressed the pickle button, firing the remaining Hydra rockets. 14 rockets detached from the underwing pods, leaving corkscrew trails of smoke as they slammed into the descending wave of fighters. The explosions walked up the slope in a rapid, devastating sequence, throwing bodies and earth into the air. But she wasn't done. She squeezed the trigger for the Avenger. Bert! The recoil from the gun was the final nail in the coffin for her airspeed. The plane decelerated violently, but the stream of 30-millimeter depleted uranium ripped across the western slope like a scythe. It chewed through the rocks, the trees, and the remaining fighters. It was a wall of impenetrable kinetic energy. The spent casings rattled furiously in the drum beneath her feet. The smell of cordite filled the cockpit entirely. The gun went dry. The drum clicked empty. Sarah immediately hauled back on the stick with every ounce of strength left in her body. The nose lifted, but barely. The A-10 scraped over the western ridgeline, the landing gear pods actually clipping the tops of the scrub brush. She cleared the mountain by less than 20 feet. The valley fell silent. Harris slowly lifted his head. His ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the sound of his own breathing. The air was thick with gray dust and the bitter smell of high explosives. He looked toward the western slope. The assault had completely stopped. The hillside was a churned, smoking ruin. Nothing moved. There was no gunfire. There were no shouts. He stood up, his knees shaking slightly. He looked around. His men were doing the same, pulling themselves out of the dirt, looking at the sky in stunned disbelief. Reynolds walked over, leaning heavily on his rifle. He looked at Harris, then looked at the smoke clearing over the mountains. "Sir," Reynolds said quietly, "are we dead?" Harris looked down at his hands. They were covered in dirt and dried blood, but they were whole. He looked at Miller, who was pale but conscious, staring up at the clearing sky. The heavy bruised storm clouds were finally beginning to break. A single shaft of pale evening sunlight pierced through the gloom, illuminating the dust hanging over the valley floor. Harris reached down and picked up the cracked radio handset for the last time. "Bore 1, outstation actual," Harris said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't entirely identify. "Enemy advance is broken. We are secure. Thank you." There was a long pause of dead air. Harris held his breath. Then a tired, ragged voice cracked over the speaker. "Copy that, actual. Glad to hear it. Send the medevac. I'm going to go find a place to park this piece of junk." Harris smiled. It was a small, tight expression, but it was real. He clipped the radio to his vest and turned back to his men. The arithmetic of war hadn't changed, but today someone had broken the calculator. "All right, listen up," Harris barked, the command authority returning to his voice in full force. "Establish a perimeter. Get the medics on the wounded. The cavalry just bought us a ticket home, and I intend to use it. Up in the pale sky, limping toward friendly lines with one dead engine and a cockpit full of smoke, Captain Sarah Mitchell finally loosened her grip on the stick. Her arms ached, her chest hurt, and she was pretty sure she was going to be grounded for violating a dozen different airspace regulations. She looked out the cracked canopy at the dying sun. She patted the battered dashboard of the Warthog. "Good girl," she whispered. "The A-10 doesn't just fly, it fights, it bleeds, and it brings our people home when the math says they shouldn't make it. If this story of raw survival, grit, and the undeniable power of the Warthog got your adrenaline pumping, drop a like and leave a comment below with your favorite A-10 moment. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more intense, grounded stories of modern military aviation. Stay safe and keep looking up.